I remember very vividly where I was on September 11th, 2001. I remember I was actually in Mrs. Stangel's sociology class at Mount Pleasant High School. And I remember, sort of like any other day, we were having, I don't remember the exact time, but it was group work. So we were all kind of branched off, and we saw somebody knock on the classroom door. Miss Stangel went over, nobody heard the context of the conversation, but she came back in with just a complete blank stare on her face, and she turned to all of us and said, "Plane just flew into the World Trade Center," just very shocked, very sort of expressionless, and we turned the TV on, and sure enough, there it was. We turned it on in time to actually see the second plane hit the building, so it was a very memorable day. I don't think I'll ever quite forget it. I don't know that there were any first reactions for me except for shock. I mean, at the time, subsequently, of course, I've lived in Egypt, learned about the Middle East. At the time, I couldn't have told you who Osama bin Laden was, not a whole lot about Islam, so the context of it was really missing for me. And what stands out about my memory is just the shock I felt that something like that could actually happen on American soil. I don't really know that I remember anything distinctly other than people being very surprised that it happened. I guess I remember surprise and I remember anger. There were definitely people that went immediately from "I don't understand" to "understand this" to, "This really makes me mad. How can we get revenge for it?" And, come to find out later that that's maybe more of the problem than we understood at the time, was the fact that there was too much of the "how can we take vengeance" and not enough "how can we understand this and prevent future instances." For one thing, if it happened today, I regret to say I'd be much less surprised, I believe. I don't think shock would be my first reaction. I would have some suspicions as to, okay, this is where this is coming from. Here's some of the usual suspects in terms of perpetrators. In terms of how my perspective's changed, it's a complete 180. My first real impressions of the Middle East were 9/11. It was sort of within that context that I began to pay a little bit more attention to information about the region. So naturally at that time, not having a whole lot of knowledge of or access to scholarly materials or good information about the region, my views were initially shaped by mainstream media and, I don't know, a lot of the political rhetoric that was coming out at the time. So to go from that to, studying the Middle East throughout my undergrad, and then subsequently, of course, living in the region, is something that, in terms of gaining perspective on Islam and gaining perspective on the region and gaining perspective at some of the underlying causes that brought about 9/11, it's absolutely invaluable to have spent time there. So in terms of how my position has evolved and how my knowledge of the situation's evolved, I would say completely. There's probably not a single perception I hold today that I can say that, that was a perception I held in 11th grade back in 2001. I completed my master's in Middle East Studies at the American University in Cairo, and I lived in Egypt for just over 2 years. All of that time living in Cairo, I traveled through other places in the region, into Israel, Palestine, into Jordan, into Turkey. But Egypt for 2 years, Cairo for 2 years, and I lived in a couple different areas of the city, it's interesting in a city that size how perspective can differ just from one area to the other. I lived in an area called Nasr City for my first year and an area called Mahdi for my second year. So, just sort of, I won't say random chance, but in a way, that's what it was. Like many students at CMU, we have the UPs, we've got to take them. Sometimes, for whatever reason, one just jumps out, maybe this is a little more interesting than something else. And that's what the class Middle East since Muhammad, History 237 was to me. It just sort of like, well, this is more interesting than other options I have here. And Dr. John Robertson, who I'm still very close with, teaches that course. And it was really that course that sort of, because it was so challenging, because so many of the positions and opinions I'd held coming in were challenged and forced to be reworked, it really got me thinking, okay, how many more layers are there to this? This is a very important region. This is something that's very relevant to us here as Americans. And for me to hold so many opinions that contradict the scholarship we're reading, what else is missing? What else can I learn? And that sort of sparked it. And then as I went on interest just snowballed, grew and grew and grew to the point where I really knew I wanted to go there. I wanted to, get my Arabic to a point where I could communicate and really dive even further in, and it just sort of evolved really from that elective course. It certainly did, and it was interesting to discuss it with my colleagues in the region too, because sometimes I think as Americans, and rightly so, we're very emotionally connected to 9/11, and I think that has often, at least I can speak for myself, at times caused sometimes a lack of desire to reassess, okay, what elements of this could have been prevented through our own policy? What elements of this, at least on an institutional political level, were the result of poor decision making on the part of the U.S.? And I think emotionally you don't want to always, as an American, revisit that, but through discussion with people that were a little more emotionally removed from it, not that these people were pro Al-Qaeda or anything like that, but it's just, you're more emotionally connected, obviously, when it happens on your soil, and you had relatives, like in my case, I have relatives that live very close to that area, so there's an emotional dimension to it. But it allowed me to sort of assess it in more realist terms and sort of learn how to kind of combine a little bit and sort out the emotional from the practical and be able to analyze 9/11 not just as an emotional event, but as a historical event with multiple layers to it. With the vast majority of people that I discussed the issue of 9/11 with were not pro-Al-Qaeda. In fact, quite the opposite. But one thing they would point to is when you talk about, why did 9/11 happen, they'll point to our policy in the region. For example, I guess specifically as it pertains to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, our policy with the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of the 70s and 80s, our policy of propping up dictators that tend to disenfranchise the populace in many Middle Eastern countries, our policy of unconditional support for Israel, and how these policies have led to not necessarily, you look at the leaders of Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, for example, has a certain ideological orientation where the U.S. is the bad guy, and that's not necessarily going to change based on what we do. There's going to be people out there that dislike the United States of America, but what our policies can do is change how well he can sell that product, how well an Al-Qaeda organization can sell that product. And what they would say is the people that are actually flying the planes into the buildings, part of the reason that they've become so disenfranchised that they're willing to buy the bin Laden narrative of us as the bad guy is that some of our policies put us in a position to be framed that way. And that was a lot of the discussion, at least in the context of, my discussion with Egyptians. They weren't sympathetic to Al-Qaeda by any measure, but certainly understood some of the policy points and some of the things the United States did that allowed Osama bin Laden, that allowed Al-Qaeda to frame us as the bad guy to populations within, and certain elements within populations, I should say, within the region. Unfortunately, I don't see a whole lot of positive change and, more informed discussion within the United States regarding Muslims in the Middle East. If anything, our country's moved, at least, a good portion of our culture has moved towards being more Islamophobic. There's been a tendency to somehow say that, Muslims, even a more nuanced perspective that would acknowledge that not all Muslims supported 9/11 or perpetrated 9/11, would at times tend to say, okay, you might not have done this, but your people did, therefore you're disconnected from it. And my point being with that, there's certainly plenty of Muslims that have suffered as a result of 9/11. There's Muslims that lost loved ones. There's Muslims that were emotionally connected to those events. And it seems like their suffering sort of been put on the fringe. They've not been able to kind of collectively have this emotional tie to 9/11 in the same way that other non-Muslim Americans can. And the cultural center is sort of, I think, a manifestation of that with the debate surrounding it in terms of Muslims that were trying to put this up obviously weren't involved with 9/11, but because they shared this common characteristic of being a Muslim, they had to be distanced from the event. And I think that that's something that pre-9/11 America, there was a misunderstanding of Muslims in the Middle East, and I don't think that there's necessarily been a reassessment of that after 9/11. And I think, if anything, the tendency to direct our anger for the events upon American Muslims has been kind of something that is very regrettable in my view. Well, I certainly think the cultural center is one bit of evidence regarding that. I think polls that continue to show that, Americans are suspicious of Muslims, that they don't necessarily feel comfortable sitting next to Muslims on a plane. The issue of whether or not Barack Obama is a Muslim or not, the fact that necessarily when he was accused of being a Muslim, he was accused of, being a terrorist. It was the same as saying you're a traitor, you're a terrorist, in a lot of connotations. And I think that was very reflective. Colin Powell gave a very good speech in the run-up to the election of the question shouldn't be, is Barack Obama a Muslim? The question should be, why does that matter? Why can't a Muslim, young man or young woman grow up in this country as an American and dream of being president of the United States? And the whole debate surrounding whether or not he was a Muslim showed that we're not there yet in that way. I think on an institutional level, if you look at our policymakers and within the political system, our lack of willingness to shift our views and policies toward the Middle East is evident just in, how we've approached the Arab Spring that's going on right now. The fact that we're still very slow to necessarily support democracy if we don't think it's going to benefit us. The fact that we still see ourselves as the gold standard, that they should be working to be more like us. There's still very much an us and them mentality and not more of an effort to look at it in a bit more of a nuanced way. And in terms of what can be done about that, I think education is really the only thing. I think that, more in high schools, for example, more classes that maybe you have a world history class that focuses more on the Middle East, more on Islam. Obviously, at the university level, there's been an expansion of those sort of classes since 9/11, and that's been good for the most part, but I think it needs to start sooner. It needs to start at other levels of education. I hope so. I know that there's certainly people, even within this university, that have been doing these things a lot longer than I have that are certainly great at it. Dr. John Robertson, again, I point to him. But I hope in some way that students that come into my class here and at Saginaw Valley come out with at least more of a nuanced understanding, willing to question the things that they're hearing about the Middle East. The ability to sort of sort out the difference between a Muslim and a terrorist, and not necessarily lumping it all in as this is what the Middle East is, this is what Islam is, being able to see that it's not one homogenous thing. There's different ideas of what Islam is within the region and outside of it, and to see that not all Muslims are out to get America and out to, destroy our way of life, and the ones that are, anti-American, so to speak, the ones that don't like our politics, don't like it for a specific set of reasons, many of which are very valid, because we've certainly made some policy mistakes along the way that haven't resonated well in the region. So, well, I think, getting to the emotional point of it, I think that it's important to comprehend the magnitude of the event in terms of how it affected us as a nation, how it affected so many people individually. But I also think it's important to know that we need to move forward in a way that's productive. It's important to get beyond the idea that it's time to seek vengeance and it's us versus them, and move more towards a view of the situation as, okay, what can we do to create a situation where this hostility doesn't exist? What can we do to create a situation where we live in a country where there's more knowledge of what's going on in the region about what Islam is and these sort of things? So just to know that it's very important that, as now with, again, I go back to the Arab Spring, after 9/11, we were faced with a moment that should have been a great moment of reassessment in terms of how we approach the region, and we fell short there. There wasn't a whole lot of reassessment. It was more of the same or worse, and I think going forward we need to learn that when moments come that necessitate that we change, that we really think long and hard about what that means and actually do reassess where we're at and where we need to go.